The Society for Culture and Environment extends a warm welcome. You are watching a session on jungle trees of central India. Pradip Krishen in conversation with Abhilash Khandekar from the Bhopal Literature and Art Festival, January 2019. Mr. Pradip Krishen is an environmentalist and a filmmaker. He has been spending time and studying trees in Pachmari, Madhya Pradesh since 1995. He has created native plant gardens in Delhi, Rajasthan and Garhwal. Mr. Abhilash Khandekar is a member of the Society for Culture and Environment. He is a senior journalist, environmentalist and president of the Madhya Pradesh Cricket Association.
Thank you for being here to listen to Pradip Krishen more than me. And we have been told that Pradip came up with the first book, Trees of Delhi. Many of us have the copy of that. But the other book, which is the central focus of this today's discussion that you may have seen, it's a field guide for tree spotters, jungle trees of central India. I have on my right Sri Pradip Krishen and on left the guru of Pradip Krishen, the tree guru of Pradip Krishen, Mr. Nishikant Jadhav, has come all the way from Nagpur. So there are not many trees, there are not many books on trees, and if there are books on trees, they are not as illustrated and as beautifully explained as these two books are. And those who are interested even a bit, say 5% in environment, they must have these both books, I must say. And those who have not seen or read this book, they must try and get it this thing, because in the literary circles it is said that a book is not complete unless and until it reaches the hands of the readers and he absorbs and reads it carefully. And this book is something which you should keep reading, and once you have it in your library, once you have it in your drawing room, once you have it in your shelf, you will be compelled to flip through it off and on, morning, evening, afternoon. So over to Pradeep, and thank you for being here. And I had an occasion to interview him on a television program, and I have also been to his place, beautiful home in Delhi, and also I would like to say that he is a great host. But coming back to trees and things like that, which I have been often asking him, why such beautiful books were not brought out by the foresters? And after that I'll ask more questions, Pradeep. But we have got Forest Research Institute, we have got many other forest related institutes all over the country, Indian Institute of Forest Management, we have got FRI in the states as well as in Dehradun and other places. And there have been some experts who have done a real good job in this thing, but they have not been able to bring out such kind of books, and also the trees of Delhi. So I would like the first question to you about a filmmaker writing such a beautiful book, taking so much of time. How much time did you take to go and visit all the places? Each and every photograph, almost each and every photograph of this, whether it is the flowering this thing or the bark or whatever, has been taken by Pradeep. So huge amount of labor has gone into this, what should I say, this Gita of trees or whatever say, but this is a very, very beautiful book. I mean, I have no words to explain. So over to Pradeep for the first question.
I can't say why foresters have not brought out books like this, but what scientists do, and I think where foresters follow, is that they believe that if you write a book about trees or about plants, you have to follow the phylogenetic, you're basically arranging plants by botanic families, you're following evolution, you're writing a scientific tome. Scientific tomes can be very informative for those people who know the botanic code and the technical language of botany, but for the average reader it's no good. But I myself, having been an amateur quite recently when I was writing my first book, I was very aware that I wanted to write this book for the average person who knows no botany at all. That is very much the intention, and therefore I didn't arrange the trees either in my Delhi book or in this book by botanic family, but I arranged them by ways in which anybody going out into the field could look at a leaf and put the leaf in the right category and find their way, almost like a detective, to making an idea of the tree. The idea was to, to make it fun and to make it accessible to the ordinary person. But, the Delhi book, in a way, was like practice. Once I'd done the Delhi book, I wanted to do a lot more with this book. And what I hoped to do was not just tell people that ye ped ko agar aapko samajhna hai, this is how you identify it, but to try and make connections with ecology, to try and show that trees are not just individual things out there like features in a landscape, but they also have to do with soils, they have to do with ecology, they have to do with all kinds of intricate things. And one of the things that I hoped to do with this book was to tell stories and to unravel things that were actually quite tricky. And if I can just take a few minutes, Abhilashji, I want to explain, I want to give you one example. I mean, so, the whole issue of why trees flower when they do and why they put out new leaves when they do. It was a puzzle to me when I started. I had no idea. I was traveling in an area that I defined, which includes most of Madhya Pradesh, but slivers of Maharashtra, sliver of UP, a sliver of Gujarat, and so on. Because I was defining my area as an ecological zone, not as a political boundary. And the more I traveled, the more I wondered about this business, because I was taking notes. I did 35 field trips in about 3 years. I was traveling every month, taking notes about what I was seeing, when trees were flowering, when they were naked, when the first new flowers were appearing, and so on. And the pattern that began to bother me and intrigue me was, we know that trees are dropping their leaves as a response to drought, right? So when you've had your last rain, let us say in September. So September, October, November, December, January, you've now 4 or 5 months from the last rains, and it seems to make eminent sense that if a tree needs to survive this prolonged period of drought, it goes dormant. And how do you go dormant? You drop your leaves and you kind of go to sleep, so to speak, right? And then you would expect that if this is so, that the new leaf would then arrive when the monsoons come. So not till late June or July. But this was never the case. You actually got new leaf arriving in the jungle as early as late March sometimes, but certainly by April and May, you're getting cascades of new leaves in the jungle. This became a huge puzzle for me, and nothing that I saw in the botanic literature gave me any kind of clues to understand why this was so. So, one of the big things I tried to do was, big for me, was try and unravel this mystery. Why is it that trees are putting out new leaves? If it's a response to drought, why is it happening 3, sometimes 4 months before the rains? And the explanation in brief is this, that basically for a tree, because there is only that one single window of the monsoon, one single pulse of rain in the year, there's only one time that is a sensible time for a tree to drop its ripe seeds on the ground to have a reasonable chance of germinating. Correct? Now, if that is so, a tree needs to count backwards from the rains. If I have to ripen my seeds to be on the ground, let us say by June or July, how long does it take me to actually, for my fruit to form and mature? And before that, for my flowers to appear and be fertilized. So a tree needs to almost count backwards to time the moment when flowers appear in order to calculate when the ripe seed has to fall. And a tree can't afford to do without leaves when flowering happens, because flowering is a very expensive business in terms of the energy that is needed to produce flowers, right? So the explanation for leaf appearance is that when a tree starts to flower, it has to produce leaves either immediately after the flowering or simultaneously with the flowers, because that is what it needs to do in terms of powering up. So this kind of information became really kind of core to what I was trying to convey. That's just one example.
Thank you, Pradip, for that illustration. But the first question I wanted to ask, and which you have addressed in the introduction itself, for those who are uninitiated, because we have been brought up seeing various kinds of trees. But what is a tree? So Pradeep has described it this segment, but I would like him to tell us: is there a specific definition about tree? What is a plant? What is a tree? You say about DBH. So some people say about DBH. So how could you tell the exact this thing of a tree? Because normally what we see is the dictionary. This thing. So here is a tree, but is there something else to tree?
You know, there are competing definitions actually that foresters use and scientists use. Some of it relates to diameter at breast height, some of it relates to how tall the tree has to be, some of it relates to whether or not it has to have a single woody stem, not multiple stems. The trouble is that depending on ecological conditions, I mean the best example I can think of is a tree that is called kardhai in parts of Madhya Pradesh, which is Anugaesis pendula. If the growing tip is browsed, it becomes a prostrate shrub that will never rise taller than these roses. It will just spread on the ground. Is it a tree or not? It actually grows to 60 feet if it's not browsed. So ecological conditions and the life history of a plant play a huge role in deciding what's going to actually happen to that plant. So it's a variable description, a variable criterion. And I've said in my book somewhere early on, I said that, you know, I've talked about plants as trees, and sometimes you won't see them as trees, but if I've seen it somewhere growing unmistakably tree-like, tall, single woody stem, I've included it in the book. So I tried to basically, you know, this book is about every native tree that I found in Madhya Pradesh. It's possible there's one or two that have been left out, but I don't think so.
So the book says that this is an ultimate guide to the trees of central India, an ideal companion for your travels into this region, that is Madhya Pradesh and many parts of this thing, even including Chhattisgarh, I believe. And this book will turn you into an expert tree spotter and take your enjoyment of wild places to another level. So if you are unable to find out a tree which is flowering and has a lot of beautiful fragrance all around, and you are not able to spot the tree or understand about it, this is the book that the publishers have kept about 1,500 it as price, but this is actually priceless, I must say. This is not, this is nothing to do with that. So the other question is that you have been to Madhya Pradesh, you have been to many other places. You love Pachmadi, at times you live in Pachmadi also. You also invited me there. I have not been able to honor your this thing. But the fact remains that what kind of forest has actually attracted you, and you have done justice to most of the trees, most of the regions, most of the seasons. But what about the special this thing other than Pachmadi that you like, or you have some concerns about that region as far as forests are concerned in Madhya Pradesh?
No, there are parts of Madhya Pradesh that I love and I love to visit, and I go back again and again. But I want to talk a little bit about my concerns, because when I was doing this book, I was often consulting older books, much older books of forestry. There's a man called D.O. Witt who wrote a book about the CP's forest, the Central Provinces forest. The book is dated 1911, I think, 1910. And he describes places that for him were the most diverse, the most interesting patches of forest, reserved forest in the Central Provinces. And I made a point of trying to visit all these places. And almost without exception, these places had been turned into teak plantations. So there's been a terrible loss of diversity in this entire region over the last, I would say, century. Because ultimately the aim of forestry as practiced by the British and as learned by the British from the German foresters, whom they brought in, was that it was an extractive industry, and that the aim was to actually make forests as productive as possible, purely from the point of view of what man intended to extract from the forest. So unfortunately the key principle was remove all those trees that are of no use to us, and only grow those trees which we have some economic use for. And I remember a story that Nishikantji told me very early on when I was first learning from him about trees in the forest. And Nishikant said to me, he said that, you know, there's a tree called the dhuban. Dhuban is the common name. It's a Dalbergia paniculata. It's a very lovely tree actually in the forest, one of my favorites. He said, dhuban ka hum log jab forestry karte the, and we were being instructed by our seniors about how we had to mark up trees for felling. We were told that dhuban ko saab aankh band karke you have to just mark with a cross and say this has to be marked for felling. He said the simple reason was that even though it's a Dalbergia, which means that it comes from the same genus as the rosewood, as the shisham that we all know and that is valued, this particular Dalbergia had this character that when you cut it into planks, there would be bands of weak cells in the planks. So if you made a plank and you sat on it, there was a real danger that the plank would suddenly just break under your weight. The result was that it was regarded as being a tree that was useless, as having, it was of no use to man, and therefore you had to just remove it from the forest without thinking. Now, of course, this is absurd, and maybe Nishi can say a little bit more about this. It's absurd that we have the arrogance to think that because we can't sit on Dalbergia's planks, it has no role in the ecology of a forest. It's absolutely patently absurd. Nishi, you want to talk about this, please?
Yes. In all the working plans under which we take forestry operations, it's mentioned that anywhere you see a dhuban tree, Dalbergia, you should remove it. It's an associate of teak, which is a very precious species, teak, but it is very exacting also. It impoverishes the soil. Whereas Dalbergia is a leguminous tree, it has got nodules in the roots, and it fixes nitrogen from the atmosphere, and that nitrogen is added to soil. Teak being an exacting species, it impoverishes soil, and Dalbergia, dhuban, this adds nutrients by way of converting nitrogen into nitric oxide, which goes to the soil, and it enriches the soil. This is the plan of the nature, which we foresters unfortunately ignored, and almost in every forest area where teak comes, the dhuban is gone. That is very unfortunate. Thank you.
So, in relation to the question, there's one other little story I want to tell. I regard the Satpura National Park as being one of the jewels of Madhya Pradesh. It really is a very, very beautiful park, although for some strange reason, entry into the park, deep into the park from Pachmani has been restricted for the last few years. I don't understand quite why this is so. But the park was begun in 1981, and it was opened in 1981, and then some forest officer who happened to have been the field director at the time must have decided that, you know, when visitors go into this most diverse, beautiful national park of Madhya Pradesh, they should be welcomed with an avenue of trees. And he would have no doubt thought, "Kaun sa ped lagaye?" What is a suitable tree to greet visitors to Central India's most diverse national park? And the tree that he must have, after thinking greatly about it, the tree he chose was the eucalyptus tree. And you know, I am absolutely astonished that somebody who has gone through, you know, training as a forester, who understands the nature of the forest, who knows what these things are, what is wrong with the way in which forestry is taught in our country? I don't understand. Nishi and me have often gone there and tried to uproot all the eucalyptus trees and the other associates with it, because it is such an affront to our understanding of, you know, how things should be done.
So that reminds me of a point that you had told me on the ridge when we were walking one fine morning, that the Delhi Forest Department or some other professionals, so-called, they tried to plant jamun trees there by just throwing the jamun seeds, and they expected jamun trees to flourish there, and it didn't happen. But is this that what is happening everywhere, most of the places, that people don't understand? I mean, your understanding about the methods of forestry and the scientific approach towards that, and about that jamun tree on the ridge.
See, almost wherever I look, it so happens that for the last 12 years or so, I've been working mostly in Rajasthan. And some of the roads between Jodhpur and Jaisalmer, for example, which is right up near the border, are some of the best roads in the country because they're maintained by the Border Roads Organization. And these lovely roads going into the desert they either have neem trees, which are planted there by a religious organization from Pali, who believe that it is their religious duty to plant, 2 crore trees in the next so many years. So you have these poor neem trees struggling in an environment that is completely uncongenial to the neem itself. They have to water them twice a week. The amount of effort and money that goes into this is crazy, Or these roads are lined with a horrible tree that is called Acacia tortilis, which is an African tree that was brought in to try and tie down dunes by the forest department in Rajasthan. And it strikes me that, there are at least 8 superb examples of desert trees that look beautiful, that flower beautifully, that are perfectly adapted to growing in these places. Why has nobody ever tried them? And it opens up the whole question of why is it that forest departments, not just here or in Rajasthan, but to my mind throughout India, we are almost blind to the fact that if you plant trees that are perfectly adapted to local ecological conditions, you save so much time, you save so much energy, you save on nutrients, you save on watering. It's just not done. And it's pretty amazing that we don't have forest nurseries, for example, where native species are available. You talk to people. I was once invited to the Asola Sanctuary in Delhi because they were going to be, giving specimens of giving plants to children to plant in Asola, and there was not one species that was guaranteed to adapt to those conditions. It wasn't from there. And I said, why have you not got any native trees? Because available nahi hai kisi nursery. But why can't you make nurseries? It's just absolutely doesn't make any sense at all.
I would like to take this debate further between there are very many officers and many environmentalists. They talk about planting trees, but they have just no idea. So there is a debate raging between the native trees and the trees which are not native. And you have always been insisting upon the plantation of native trees, but yet many schemes in many places, not only in central India but elsewhere also, we see. In fact, I had spoken to you about one nursery in Hyderabad which claims to be selling trees which are 800-year-old, 600-year-old, and you get to see the advertisements in some of the magazines of Jet and this thing. So, and there is not even a single butterfly which these trees attract, not to speak about birds and things like that. So, native trees and those which we said विलायती कीकर या बाकी बहुत सारी नई जो species आ रही हैं, and they are being planted in the name of plantations. So how to stop that?
I want to share with you a little bit of research I did last year. I was trying to find out what are the number of native trees that you get in different parts of the world. It's quite an intriguing set of figures. According to a particular wing of Kew Gardens in England, India is home to something like 3,400 species of native trees in all our different biomes, from the Himalayas to the coastal regions to the deserts to the rainforests. That's a fair amount of trees. And you compare that to England, which has about 17 species of native trees. Germany, with something like 32 species of native trees. So 3,400 versus 27, 34, 15. The whole of the US is about 1,000 species. The whole of Europe is somewhere between 1,500, 2,000 species. So we're a very biodiverse country. We're not at the top of the tree because if you look at places like China or Indonesia, or certainly the Amazon basin, those figures are much higher. Be that as it may, Do you know how many trees we actually use in our parks and gardens and on our avenues? The number of native trees is roughly 50. We use 50 trees out of 3,400 trees that we actually have as native trees in our country. I believe that there is something seriously wrong with us as a culture and as a civilization, that we don't even have the curiosity. And even the people who are charged with actually looking after our forests don't have the initiative to say, we're going to grow these trees. We're going to see whether not all trees will adapt to living in a city or living in a park or being, living in serried ranks along an avenue. But why not try? And the British, with all their faults, I mean, the British made many mistakes when they were planting trees, and I've written about this extensively in the context of what was planted in Lutyens, Delhi, for example. But even they were experimenting. They took the Anjan, the Hadwikia, which comes from the Satpuras and further south, they took that to Delhi and said, we're going to try with the Anjan. Anjan did brilliantly, but we don't experiment with a single tree that is not already in a nursery or is not an exotic at this moment in time.
So you refer to your project in Rajasthan. I would like to tell the audience about this. This is Rao Jodha Desert Rock Park, on which he has been working for many years, and it is something really extraordinary. And those who have not seen that is then explored the wild side of Mehrangarh. So I would like and I would request Pradip to talk about that project, because that is something very unique in the country which is going on and very quietly. Not many people know about it. But growing plants on the rocks in Rajasthan is something that he has been trying very successfully. And the trust which is supporting this thing, I would like also to know about that trust, where they are so much interested in greening this whole area.
So in 2005, I was invited to the Mehrangarh Fort, which controls an area of about 70 hectares of volcanic rock. It's a big outcrop of volcanic rock, which lies on both sides of the fort. And this area was almost entirely a wasteland that had been invaded by Vilaiti Kikar, Prosopis juliflora, which had come in from. So basically what had happened was that one of the Maharaja Umaid Singh, in the 1930s was told that, if you want to green your desert kingdom, there's this magical tree that comes from Mexico and further south, which doesn't need nutrients, doesn't require water, will grow in rock. उसके बीज आप मंगा दीजिए and you broadcast it, खूब आपका desert हरा भरा हो जाएगा. So he used to fly his own aeroplane, and I like to think of him looking a little bit like Biggles with his leather goggles and a headdress. But he went up in an aeroplane, and he literally broadcast hundreds of bags of seeds of Prosopis juliflora throughout the kingdom of Jodhpur, which I must remind you was a lot larger than the district of Jodhpur is today, because it would have extended all the way to the borders of Gujarat. So this area was one of those areas that was absolutely chock full of Vilaiti Kikar. No two trees were further than the distance between us. And what they said to me was, they said, can you green this area for us, because it's now a mess. And of course I took one look at the Prosopis and I thought, my God, how are we going to get rid of this quantum of Prosopis, because it's notoriously hard to eradicate. But apart from the normal issues of eradicating this tree, there was also the issue of having to dig into volcanic rock, which is even harder than granite. This is a rock called rhyolite. But
750 million year old?
750 million year old volcanic rock. So I said to them, I said, look, I want to be clear what you mean by wanting me to green this land, because if you want lawns and flowering trees and a park, a normal municipal park kind of thing done here, you're going to need to bring in literally millions of tons of soil. You're going to need to bulldoze a lot of the historical landscape of the Mehrangarh Fort, and you're going to have to water these plants every single day as long as they live. And is that something that you possibly want? Obviously the answer was no. So they said, well, what is the option? I said, well, the option is that we can try and create an ecological landscape of plants that are from other volcanic parts of the desert, other rocky parts of the desert, and try and create a sustainable landscape that doesn't require any watering or any looking after once these plants have actually taken, once they've established themselves. And they were a little skeptical about the possibility of doing this. They didn't quite know what it would look like. And they said, we'll give you 3 years to show us what you can do. And after that, we'll take a call about the long term. But to cut a long story short, we did it. We removed the precipice. We brought in plants. We had to educate ourselves about what grows where and what is the kind of ecological niches that all the different plants need. But we've now grown a very, very interesting landscape. It's taken us 13 years. And literally, we don't water anything. We don't look after these plants at all. If we see a plant dying for lack of water, we say, well, that plant has to go. It's the wrong plant in the wrong place. It needs to be replaced with something else that is going to be equipped to deal with those kind of conditions. And I believe that especially when you have large landscapes and difficult landscapes and difficult situations, that is the way to go. You work with native plants that have been adapted through millions of years of evolution to cope with precisely those conditions.
Something about those traditional people who have worked with you in actually extracting these plants to some kind of native technology of breaking this thing and this thing. They're very hardworking people, and not many people are there who know this, who possess this knowledge.
So when we first had to remove the precipice, we tried to find out what we needed to do in order to remove these trees, because, as I said, it's notoriously hard to if you just chop a tree at its base, it'll just coppice again with redoubled vigor. And we looked up the net, and what we discovered was that this tree needs to be chopped 2 feet below the ground, because it has a budding zone that goes down 2 feet. So if you chop it less than 2 feet, it just coppices again. But the issue was, how do you get down into this extremely hard rock? You couldn't take mechanical, JCBs or anything into this area. It's much too uber-khabar, much too difficult. So we got lots of kind of folk, suggestions. And we said, iske upar, cut it, put fresh gobar on top, say this mantra, and of course, none of it would work. People said, use dynamite, and when they saw a look of horror on our faces, they said, no, we don't mean, big charges of dynamite. What we mean is that 1/100th the normal charge, and it'll just go down into the roots and it'll kill the plant. And we said, show us. And they blew the top off a little tekra, and we said, look, this is not what we want to do. People said, obviously, using toxic chemicals was another option, which we didn't want to use because all of this land slopes down into water bodies that provides drinking water to the town of Jodhpur. And finally, somebody said, we have these wonderful community of traditional miners called Khandwalias who live in Jodhpur. And for generations, they've been working with rock, with native rock. Why don't you try them? And I was skeptical because, see, the building stone that is used in Jodhpur is actually sandstone. And sandstone compared to this volcanic rock is like butter. It's very, very soft rice. So I didn't think they would be able to manage, but we met a man called Dhan Singh, who was the leader of one of the tolas of Khandwalia, and we showed him a precipice bush which was not much higher than this podium, and we said, can you dig down 2 feet and show us that you can do this? He said, how's that? No problem. So they use these extremely heavy hammers, which are about 4 or 5 kilograms a head, and a chaining, a chisel. And what he did was he sat down on his haunches, and he tapped the ground lightly, and then he turned his face away, and he smote the ground 3 times hard. And I assumed that the reason he was turning his face away was that he didn't want shards of the rock to go into his eyes. But it turned out, and we only discovered this later, that what he was actually doing was he was listening to the sound of his hammer on the rock. And from the sound, he could tell how the rock is interbedded, kahan se pola hai, kahan se bhara hai. All the information that he needed to cut in, he derived just from 3 hammer blows, and he was by listening. So obviously these people had a whole technique of looking at rock and understanding rock and being able to work with rock that was priceless. So we then finally hired a cricket team with some extras of Khandwalias, 15 Khandwalias. We actually gave them cricket floppies and protective eyewear, which they discarded within a week. And we literally then went plot by plot, 70 hectares. It took us 7 years, actually, to clear all the precipice from these 70 hectares. But without these Khandwalias, we would have been in real trouble.
So visit Mehrangarh whenever you can. So one more question about the jungle trees and tree spotting, the art of. I want to ask you and then I'll ask you. So I wanted to ask you, you have been actually saying, and not many people say this thing about, but he is your tree guru. I mean, guru is guru. So a few words about guru first, or from the guru about Chela.
All right, I'll talk about my guru first. So this is just a little story about how I actually began to get interested in trees. I was building a house at the edge of the jungle next to Nishikant in a place called Bariam near Pachmadi, and me and my architect friend Golak would go walking in the jungle. Walks became longer and longer and longer because we were enjoying the jungle so much. And very often we'd take Nishi along with us, and Nishi would say, "Isko jante ho us ped ko?" So we'd say, "Nahi bhaiya, kya hai ye?" He said, "Isko hum rohan bolte hain. Soimida febrifuga." So we started calling these our Latin words because Nishi would tell us the Latin names of all these trees. And it gradually, we got in. Initially we were sort of, "Theek hai, so what?" And then we got more and more interested. And then we said, Golak and me said, "Why don't we make a project of trying to know the names of all the trees in this jungle?" Nishi, yahan kitne ped honge? How many trees? Nishi said, "Honge koi 100 ek." We thought, if it's 100 trees, maybe it's doable. We're going to be here a year and a half. We didn't get there. We didn't get to 100 trees in that year and a half. But we probably got to about 60 or 65. And it became a hobby, much like, bird watching, bird spotting. And it, that's really where it began. And that's why I credit Nishi as being my tree guru.
So one of the finds and achievements for me of this BLF is to meet the tree guru, because when I first read the book Trees of Delhi, there was a mention. It was sometime in 2004 or 5 that book came out, or maybe 6. And I read up this thing, and the first time I came to know about Pradip's tree guru, and today I find him here. You belong to Madhya Pradesh, you have been Madhya Pradesh forest officer. So could you tell something which is not known about Pradip to all of us? Not known to us. But what kind of chela he has been? You had to do a lot of work on him. Something really not known about him.
Yes.
Hope it will not.
No. While we had our sorties in the jungle, there are certain medicinal plants which are extremely bitter. One of them is kalmid, or you call it mahatik, Andrographis paniculata. It is, I think there is nothing more bitter than this mahatik. So I just plucked a leaf and gave it to Pradip. I said, "Pradip, this leaf is so tasty, so sweet. Just taste it." He tasted it and he enjoyed it for half an hour, and for 1 hour I was fired like anything. Second thing I'll tell you, there is a plant which has very fragrant flower, but the moment you crush the flower, it's horribly fetid, very bad smelling. So I'll tell him, "Pradip, this is such a beautiful flower, just smell it." He'll smell it, "Oh, so nice smell." And then I'll crush it. Pradip, just smell it. He said, "Oh, क्या करते हो निशी, वो मेरे साथ इस तरह का मजाक करते हो." So these things which are not known to anybody, I am telling. Thank you.
So the time is running out. It should not be running out, and despite I being an organizer, they are not giving me any concession, which I am trying to take. So last question, Pradip, about there are many interviews. I live in Delhi. You live in Delhi. Many people of of organizers live in Delhi. Many interviews keep appearing in Delhi newspapers about you, talking about environment and tree cutting. The NBCC recently tried to cut many, and there was a very, very controversial interview which I read in either Hindu or Hindustan Times. And many forest officers also, some of my friends, in which perhaps you said कि forest officers मालूम नहीं क्या हो रहा है. तो दिल्ली में जो 2 इश्यूज हैं, एक तो लोग कहते हैं कि बहुत पेड़ होने के बावजूद भी पोल्यूशन बढ़ रहा है, And some people said, you had taken me to Aravali's, so I'm saying कि अरावलीज में बहुत सारे पेड़ कट रहे हैं, तो उधर से जो हवाएं आती है उसके कारण पोल्यूशन रुकता था जब बहुत अच्छे पेड़ वहाँ होते थे. तो आज दिल्ली में जो प्रदूषण है, can it really be tackled with more plantation of trees, better plantation of trees, better species and things like that? This is my last question of the session.
Well, it's actually quite a complicated subject, but the short answer is trees can help, but not a whole lot. You know, the fundamental problems about pollution. You know, think of it like this. It's like you take any system and you overload that system, and it'll eventually just tip over and collapse. And that's what's happening to a city like Delhi. It's tipped to be the largest city in the world in 25 years. It's going to have more than 52 million people. There's no way that you can keep the air clean, you know, unless, of course, you got if all your automobiles switch to, you know, hydrogen or water or whatever it is that they can, a fuel that is not going to, you know, emit electric. Those are solutions. You know, those are big solutions. But you know, you've got a problem of just sheer magnitude and scale that is, you know, that is very, very frightening. I don't think trees can make a small difference. Shall we open it out to questions?
Yes. So questions?
No time.
No, but I'll take two questions. Two questions, please. Anyone?
Okay, one question, Abhilash.
Yes. How can I say no to you, sir?
Pradip and Nishi ji, tell me, Israel has done a very massive reclamation of the Negev desert by planting trees, and they've obviously got the right tree to reclaim the desert, whereas in our case, Nishkanji, we've imported eucalyptus, Vilayati kikar, subagool, and I remember when I started my service in 1983 in Satna, Mrs. Gandhi came and we were told that subagool is a great tree, and it was earlier called pubagool, but she said that it's such a nice tree, it should be called subagool. Where have we gone wrong in this?
Again, it's a complex answer, but I haven't been to Israel, but my understanding is that what Israel has done is basically they have made the desert into something that's going to produce the things that they want the desert to produce. They've made it into an agricultural field, right? Mostly by planting exotic things and fruit-bearing things that they want. I don't believe that that is the right way to go about things, unless, you know, obviously Israel has no other option. Israel is a desert state and has no real arable land. I don't believe that the way to try and work with our desert, say in Rajasthan, is to try and convert that desert into something else. But to, you know, there are whole aspects of, can I just take 3 minutes to say something, you know, I think which is really important. When I've traveled around southern Jaisalmer district, I've seen what are now remnant patches of original vegetation of what this place must have been like before it was disturbed by too many cattle, too many this, too many that. They're beautiful places and they're perfectly adapted to where the desert is. This is the original jungle of the desert. It's a shrubland of grasses and shrubs, very few trees. And that's what should actually be happening in the desert, but not trying to do what Kazri and other government organizations are trying to do, which is to plant things like Israeli babool, under which nothing grows, in whose branches no trees, no birds nest. There's absolutely no ecological value. So to actually interfere with nature, to my mind, is something that's actually not very wise.
There is a question from there. Can you please identify yourself?
I'm Rahul Singh. I run a lit fest in Kasoli where Pradip has been in the past. I'd like to ask you about
Can we get a mic for him?
I'd like to ask you about the mahua. You know, that is made into the flowers are made into an alcohol spirit. Are there any other trees which lend themselves, the flowers lend themselves to something like that? Because somebody in Goa called Desmond Nazareth has made this into a very, very good alcohol, native alcohol, and he's trying to grow native spirits like cashew. Are there any other? There's cashew, of course, and there's mahua. Anything else that you can think of which lends itself to that?
Well, in terms of the biochemistry of alcohol making, any fruit that has sugar in it is convertible into alcohol. So whether it is the jamun, for example, or even the kosam, things like that, they're all, you can make alcohol from them. But the mahua is very much the king of all the alcohol fruits in this part of the world. And I must say that, when I was, all these 35 trips that I made into Madhya Pradesh, looking, studying the trees, the emblematic tree for me of central India was the mahua. You cross Gwalior, you start to see in Bundelkhand the mahua, along with the chudel and amongst all these trees. And that was the first sign that you had now entered the heartland of India. I think you have to stop there.
Question? Question? Okay.
My name is Madhu Verma. I work with the Institute of Forest Management. I'm an ecological economist. Well, the question is regarding so far as plantation goes in the country, we go by the visual delight of trees. What looks beautiful and we plant that. And with that particular process.
I wish that was true.
Yeah, we have brought lots of non-native and exotic trees. As rightly said, like we talked about, what is thing to see here about dhuban. It's very appropriately titled tree. It does a very wonderful function of cleansing the atmosphere. So if you are able to also portray in terms of ecological values of these trees, then people would understand better and will be doing native tree plantation, so far as plantation drive goes. So what's been your efforts in this regard?
Maybe I talk to you outside about that because it's a lot.
Yeah.
Ramesh?
See, we are not using the knowledges of scriptures, Ramayana, Mahabharata, many other things where these trees are mentioned actually. It is also giving in the actual values and lot of, if you see the culture behind it, we have been doing a lot of things have been happening around. That knowledge is not being transmitted, that's why we are losing all the things. Scientifically, this needs to be studied and brought out also. Otherwise, it is being treated just like, some text they have mentioned. Is any work being done on that?
Not that I know.
Because the original text has a lot of mentions.
So my last question, because you are in Bhopal, in Madhya Pradesh capital, there is a new fad of many governments planting crores of trees in Madhya Pradesh along Narmada. There is a claim that 6 crore trees were planted or are being planted. Is that something which is possible?
Yes, it's definitely. So 6 crores is just the numbers of trees, not the number of species. No, it's possible to plant 6 crore trees. It just needs to be wisely chosen, and I just hope that people are choosing wisely. But it's in my experience, people don't choose very wisely, especially governments don't do that.
Thank you very much, Pradip, and thank you.
Thank you for watching the session from BLF 2019. Kindly subscribe to our channel for more such videos.